The following is a recording of a live questions and answers session with Chris McCann that took place on Friday, November 17th, 2017.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a pre-recorded eBible Fellowship's Questions and Answers time. This program is designed to interact with you with your questions and comments related to the Bible, and we'll try to respond as well as possible by going to the Bible. And so, with our Bibles at the ready, it's now time to turn things over to our speaker for this pre-recorded questions and answers time, and say hello to Chris McCann.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to eBible Fellowship's Friday night question and answer program. During this time, we're going to open up the room to take your call, and each person is invited to share what's ever on your mind by dialing the number that was mentioned at the start of the program. And I'll try to respond as much as possible by going to the Bible, as the Bible is God's holy word. And it is there that we find answers to our spiritual questions according to God's good pleasure, according to His will. Well, we have only a short time together, so we're going to get started right away by going to the first person on the phone tonight. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Quick question I have. I had seen you on Facebook, and you were talking about how God was going to bring judgment and how He was doing that through division. And I got it on Facebook, but I want a couple of my friends who are not on Facebook to also hear the answer. Can you run through it again, please?
Well, yeah. We know some things for certain. We know some things for certain because the Bible teaches them. And when the Bible teaches something, it's a certainty. We know that Judgment Day for the world has begun, that it began on the date of May 21, 2011. And we know that just as assuredly as we know that God brought judgment on the churches and that He ended the church age. We know it the identical way that God brought to pass a spiritual judgment, and that He has revealed this judgment on the church first to His people, and now on the world also to His people. And since the Bible has locked in the date for the beginning of judgment, and since the elect are still living on the earth, and time is continuing for years after that starting point, May 21, 2011, then it really is a help to us to go back to the Bible and to ask questions. For example, well, how's it possible that we could be in Judgment Day? And we find, well, the Bible teaches spiritual judgment all over the place. The most major judgments in the Bible have all been spiritual. The judgment in the Garden of Eden upon Adam and Eve, or mankind. The judgment of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. The judgment on the church. Spiritual. And so the judgment on the world is in keeping with the same thing that God has done, the way He's operated in bringing judgments in the past. So that answers that. Yes, there has been spiritual judgments, which means a spiritual judgment could have commenced, and so we're not off base to see that the Bible locks in a date like May 21, 2011 without releasing it, without showing us any error, and so we understand a spiritual judgment must have taken place on the world, and that leads us to ask further questions. Well, if the world is under spiritual judgment, what can we know about that judgment? And again, we can look at the very good example of God bringing a spiritual judgment on the churches. And when we read Jeremiah chapter 25, God does indicate that he begins the judgment process on the city called by his name, and then it transitions to the nations. But also in that chapter, we read of the cup of the wrath of God, and we find it's the same cup. The cup that was given first to the city called by his name is identical to the cup later given to the nations. And again, spiritual judgment on the church, spiritual judgment on the world. So that means we have an excellent example of a spiritual judgment at the beginning of Judgment Day with the way that God judged the churches. So we look at the churches and we just learn as much as we can, and then we look to the world and we wonder, well, how is the spiritual judgment working itself out? And there are actually a few different ways, but you asked about division. And the Bible makes an interesting statement concerning Satan and his kingdom in Mark chapter 3, when the scribes were charging that Jesus cast out devils by the prince of the devils, Beelzebub. They were saying he was of Satan. And then in response, in Mark 3, verse 23, it says, "And he called them unto him, and said unto them in parables, How can Satan cast out Satan? And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end." So we notice some very interesting things. Notice how many times it says cannot stand, cannot stand. Well, when we read Psalm 1, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment. Revelation 6, the last verse, I think it's verse 17, speaks of the day of the wrath of God and asks the question, who shall stand? Well, the elect all stand before the judgment seat. And to stand means to endure. So the elect left on the earth to go through the demonstration of judgment, appear before the judgment seat, and endure to the end, we stand. But none of the wicked will stand. So that's one thing. And another thing is that it's speaking of Satan's kingdom, and if it's divided, it cannot stand, but has an end. So the Lord is giving us an important bit of information concerning the end of the kingdom of Satan. And on May 21, 2011, Christ took the kingdom of Satan. He overcame the kingdom of darkness, Satan, in this world. And Satan was put down. And so now we see in the world, because Satan has had his kingdom divided at this time of his end, we see that there is constant, of course there's always been warfare and gossiping and backbiting and devouring, but nothing like this. We see that all the institutions, well, I won't say all just yet, but many are toppling, as it were, in a spiritual way, as all kinds of hidden things are coming to light. The hidden things of media manipulation, all the sexual harassment charges are coming to light with politicians and entertainers, and and all kinds of powerful people. It is the fall of Satan's kingdom. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, when the enemies of Judah, the enemies of God's kingdom, come to battle, they're coming against Judah initially, but they end up fighting one another, destroying one another completely. And that's why God has a prophet declare to his people, you will not need to fight in this battle. The Lord will fight for you. And the way the Lord is fighting is by stirring up trouble within the enemy camp so that they're destroying one another, bringing down one another. And this is a big part of the spiritual judgment, which is bringing to light the sins of mankind, which is causing public shame and humiliation. And when these sins are coming to light, really it's revealing the spiritual dead condition of the people of the world. It's revealing their sinful nature. And this has typically been hidden. It's why Pharisees could be like whitewashed sepulchres. Outwardly, they appear righteous. They appear to not have all that many ugly sins or relationship to sin. But in Judgment Day, God is bringing the actual spiritual condition of man to the surface, and in that way, he's exposing their dead, dry bones. Or like Jesus said of the Pharisees, outwardly they appear one way, but inwardly they're full of dead man's bones. And that's why the Bible makes reference to the graves or the bones being exposed and the shame that results. We thought it would be literally God would bring up the dead bodies, but he's doing it spiritually by revealing the spiritually dead condition of man, showing inside what has always been there and exposing it. It's like bringing the bones to the surface, and so this should continue. Now in Daniel chapter 5, and this historically is taking place in the year 539, exactly at the end of 70 years. At the end of 70 years, and that 70 years typify the Great Tribulation. So what we read in Daniel 5 has to do with May 21, 2011, the beginning point of Judgment Day, and it's when the king of Babylon, who's a type of Satan, saw the writing on the wall, and it troubled him greatly to the point that his knees knocked together. And then finally Daniel came and interpreted the writing. And this also has to do with God bringing forth revelation in the day of judgment, as he has been doing for the last few years. It says in Daniel 5, in verse 25, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then verse 30 says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And who does he represent? Satan. And it's right at the end of 70 years. And that's why eBible Fellowship continues to say that Satan has been put down, deposed, right at the start, May 21, 2011. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Darius, who is called the Lord's anointed, in the book of Isaiah, and that's the word Messiah. Or Cyrus is, and Cyrus and Darius are the same man. So he's a clear picture of Christ taking the kingdom. Just like Mordecai in the book of Esther took all the house of Haman, and Haman was hanged. And we can show that Haman was hanged on the 17th day of the second month. And May 21, 2011 had the 17th day of the second month of the Hebrew calendar underlying it. So there's a second supporting verse pointing to Haman, a type of Satan, being put down on that day, Mordecai, a type of Christ, being lifted up. Just like here, the king of Babylon, slain, Darius takes the kingdom. And yet, the important thing, as far as your question, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So the kingdom of Satan at this time has been divided. And that's what we see when we look out in the world. It doesn't matter what anyone says about any topic. You're as soon as it's said, almost half the people are against it, and it is really chaotic. And that's because the kingdom of Satan has fallen and has an end, and so this division is really in evidence that has taken place. But thank you for calling and sharing, and let's go to the next person. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Could you read and maybe explain, if you know, about Haggai, chapter 2, verse 18, through I guess, through the end of the chapter 23?
Well, let's take a look. In Haggai 2, it says in verse 18, "Consider now, from this day and upward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, even from the day that the foundation of Jehovah's temple was laid, consider it. Is the seed yet in the barn? Yea, is yet the vine and the fig tree, and the pomegranate, and the olive tree, hath not brought forth? From this day will I bless you." And again, the word of Jehovah came unto Haggai in the 24th day of the month, saying, "Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, or the nations, and I will overthrow the chariots, and those that ride in them, and the horses, and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. In that day, saith Jehovah of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith Jehovah, and will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith Jehovah of hosts." Well, I have some ideas, but it would just be speculation right now for me to say anything. We can tell that it has to do with the end. Verse 23, "In that day, and overthrowing the throne of kingdoms, and destroying the kingdoms of the heathen or the nations." But as far as the reference to the 24th day of the 9th month and some other things, I don't know. It's not something that I can really explain at this point. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Chris, can you please explain 2 Samuel 13:19? In verse 19, is there a spiritual, in other words, what is God telling us spiritually? There is something spiritual when God said to Tamar, she ran and put her hand on the head after her brother attacked her.
Let's see, in 2 Samuel 13, let's see, yes, this is when Ammon forced Tamar, and it says in verse 18, she had a garment of divers colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Then his servant brought her out and bolted the door after her, and Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of divers colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went on crying. And Absalom, her brother, said unto her, Hath Ammon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister, he is thy brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Well, historically, we know that there's all kinds of trouble in King David's family, and part of this had to do with God allowing it in order to chastise David for his sin. But Tamar, with her garment of divers colors, and she was a virgin, was picturing, I'd like to say God's elect, but she was picturing someone who identified with the true gospel, or identified with the gospel of the Bible. You know, the Bible tells us in Matthew 25 of 10 virgins, 5 are wise and 5 are foolish. And the 10 virgins typify all that profess the name of Christ. And of those who say they're a Christian, you have those that are truly saved or elect, the wise, and you have those that aren't saved and are not elect, the foolish. But for a time, they all have the name of a virgin, and in that parable of Matthew 25, the wise and the foolish couldn't be determined for a while. So just because someone's a virgin doesn't necessarily mean that she's typifying God's elect. And so Tamar is wearing this garment of divers colors and was a virgin, but then is defiled with her brother Amnon, and this leads to her becoming desolate. So spiritually, again, I'll just sort of make a comment that might lead in a direction, but I'm not going to try and explain it all. You know, these scriptures are historical parables that are they're just full of meaning. We when we go through the book of Genesis, there's a reason why it takes hours and hours and hours and hours to go through one chapter, and sometimes we do 20, 30, or 40 Bible studies in a single chapter of the Bible because there's so much information there, and so I'm not going to try and lay it all out, but it could be that this would identify with the spiritual judgment on the church, on the corporate church, where spiritually virgins would be found, and yet they're defiled. And what defiles someone in the spiritual realm is other kinds of gospels. So it could go in that direction. But I've never gone through this chapter verse by verse to say for sure. But thank you for bringing up that verse and for your question, and let's go to the next person. This will be our last call tonight. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Is there a day in the Word this Sunday?
Yeah, you know there's a day in the Word this Sunday. Well, yes, there is. Thank you for bringing it up and reminding me.
You're right.
Lord willing, this Sunday we'll have a day in the Word at the hall in Merchantville, New Jersey, and it'll start at 10 a.m. and go to 5 p.m. And all are invited. If anyone's interested in directions or if you want any further information, you can send an email to eBibleFellowship@juno.com. eBibleFellowship@juno.com. But thank you for calling and sharing. I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for the questions that you brought up, and especially for the Bible verses we had an opportunity to read and consider. We have come to the end of our time now, so I'm going to say good night, and may you have a good night, and may the Lord's perfect will be done.
And thank you for joining us again for eBible Fellowship's Questions and Answers time with your speaker, Chris McCann. You can join us for these questions and answers sessions Sunday afternoons following the Sunday studies and certain weeknights following the Monday through Friday studies. Check eBibleFellowship.com for the current schedule. Until next time, may the Lord's perfect will be done.